He owns a knife that costs more than his first car. He has 3 different types of salt. He once spent a Sunday afternoon making stock, just stock, with the focused energy of someone defusing a bomb. Nobody asked him to. Nobody was coming over. He just did it because that's what he does. And here's the thing most people get wrong about him. They think it's a hobby, something he picked up in his 40s to fill the time, a phase, something he saw on Netflix and decided to try. But if you actually look at where this guy came from and why cooking became such a specific and almost obsessive part of his life, the story is a lot more interesting than a man and his Le Creuset pot, because this didn't start with a food channel. It didn't start with a pandemic sourdough kit. It didn't start with some revelation about work-life balance. This started in an empty house, a Tuesday afternoon in 1979. He was 9 years old, and nobody was home. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, is the generation that basically raised itself. About 40% of them were what people called latchkey kids. They came home from school, let themselves in with the key around their neck, and existed in that quiet house for a few hours until a parent got back. No supervision, no schedule. No one checking what they were doing. Just a kid in a kitchen. The stove was not a choice. The stove was a solution. You were hungry, there was food somewhere in there, and you figured it out. Not because someone taught you, because the alternative was waiting, and waiting was boring. So they learned in that completely unsentimental, trial and error way how to feed themselves. Ramen. Frozen things. Whatever was in the fridge that could become something edible with enough heat and optimism. Burned grilled cheese, canned pasta that required genuinely no skill whatsoever. Cereal at 4 p.m., which is a meal if you believe in yourself. It wasn't culinary, it was practical. And that distinction matters more than it sounds. Because what that experience did, without anyone noticing, was remove the psychological barrier that kept men out of the kitchen for generations. For the men who grew up before them, cooking was women's work. It had a gender tag, a whole cultural story attached to it. But for the latchkey kid standing alone in front of a microwave in 1981, there was no gender tag. There was just dinner. The kitchen was neutral territory because it had to be. Because the only other option was hunger, and he was 9. Fast forward 20 years and something interesting happens. These same guys, now in their 20s and 30s, watch the food world start to change around them. The 1990s celebrity chef era arrives, and suddenly, cooking on television looks nothing like their mother's afternoon shows. These chefs are aggressive, technical, and a little dangerous. They treat a kitchen like a workshop, not a domestic space. They swear. They have opinions about things that most people don't even know exist. Gordon Ramsay, born 1966, shows up and basically makes competence look like a superpower. The whole persona is built on the idea that standards matter and softness is a liability. Gen X men recognize that energy immediately because it's the language they grew up in. Nobody clapped for you when you figured out dinner alone. You just did it right, or you didn't. Anthony Bourdain, spiritually Gen X, even if the birth year is slightly off, brought something different. The idea that food was a way to connect to the world without having to be vulnerable about it. You could travel, eat strange things, absorb other cultures, process whatever was going on inside you, all through what was on the plate. High passion, low emotional declaration. That was a format Gen X men could work with. And then there's Heston Blumenthal, also born 1966, who just took the whole thing apart and rebuilt it in a laboratory. Cooking as a science project. Cooking as inquiry, cooking as the systematic destruction of every assumption that came before it, which is exactly what a certain kind of Gen X brain wants to do with anything it cares about. These weren't just famous chefs. They were mirrors. An entire generation of men had been quietly doing something in their kitchens and weren't sure yet what to call it. Then these 3 showed up and gave it a name. The kitchen was a workshop. The cook was a craftsman. And nobody had to feel weird about caring this much. I noticed something when I started going deep into the research on this. There's a specific moment, usually somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, when the Gen X man's relationship with cooking shifts. Before that, it's functional, competent. He cooks well, he's better than most of his friends, And he knows it. But at some point, it becomes something more deliberate. He starts researching. He gets a knife that requires care. He has opinions about heat distribution. He buys a cast iron skillet and seasons it with the seriousness of someone performing a ritual because he is. He starts a sourdough starter and names it, which is something he would absolutely never tell anyone he did. Some of them have spreadsheets, not metaphorical spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets for smoke times, fermentation pH, internal meat temperatures across different cuts, logged with notes on a Saturday night. What's happening there psychologically is well documented. Researchers call it mastery motivation, the drive to build genuine competence in something tangible, something where the result is real and measurable. For a generation that grew up without a lot of external validation and entered a professional world that often feels increasingly abstract, with all its emails, metrics, and meetings about meetings that could have been emails, the kitchen offers something genuinely rare. You either cooked it well or you didn't. The feedback is immediate and honest in a way that almost nothing else in adult life is anymore. The steak is perfect or it isn't. The bread rose or it didn't. Nobody's giving you a performance review with areas for growth. You just know. And once you notice that, you see these men everywhere. The guy at the farmer's market who knows every vendor by name and has actual opinions about which farm's eggs are worth the premium. The one who spent an entire weekend building the ideal backyard smoker setup and considers it the most productive thing he did that month. The man who says almost nothing emotionally direct, but somehow feeds everybody. And then there's the solo dimension, which is where things get genuinely interesting. A significant chunk of Gen X men live alone. This happened through various paths: divorce, late marriage, deliberate choice, or just life doing what life does. The result is similar regardless of the path: a man, his kitchen, and nobody else to cook for. The common assumption is that this leads to sad sandwiches and cereal for dinner. And for some men, it does. Studies confirm there's a real psychological hurdle in the idea that it's not worth cooking for just one person. That thought, why bother, is a low-grade depression logic that shows up in the research with uncomfortable regularity. Living alone has a measurable effect on mental health. The coefficient is real, and the researchers are not cheerful about it. But here's what happens with the Gen X man who loves to cook. He rejects that thought almost instinctively. Not always consciously, just instinctively. Because for him, cooking was never really about the audience. It was never primarily a social performance. It started as a solitary act. Him and that empty kitchen, him figuring things out alone. And that origin makes it entirely natural to do it alone at 52. He's not cooking for the dinner guests who aren't there. He's cooking because the act itself is the thing. Researchers in Vancouver who studied men living alone found that Gen X men in particular held unusually high food ideals. They cared about what they ate, sourced ingredients deliberately, treated home preparation as worth the effort, even when it was just for themselves. And when they dug into why, the answers weren't really about nutrition. They were about structure, about having something in the day that required skill and attention, and produced a visible result. A proper meal means the day didn't completely collapse. That's not a small thing. That's actually a fairly important thing. Cooking was functioning as what psychologists call work leisure, an activity that's relaxing precisely because it demands your full attention. You cannot worry about your mortgage while you're breaking down a whole chicken. Your hands are busy. Your mind has something specific to do. The elaborate Thursday night steak with a perfect sear made for nobody but himself. Plated up nice because he felt like it. That's not sad. That's kind of impressively Gen X, honestly. No apology. No audience required. There's also solid scientific evidence now that the fermentation projects these men tend to drift toward, sourdough, kimchi, kombucha, home brewing, charcuterie, whatever they've decided to monitor this month, actually do something measurable to mental health. The lactobacillus cultures in traditional ferments produce compounds that affect mood at a biological level, which means the man checking the pH of his sourdough starter at 11 p.m. is, without knowing it, running a fairly effective antidepressant program in a glass jar on his counter. The research on this is real. He didn't know that when he started, he just found it interesting, which is exactly the Gen X way of stumbling into self-care. Through a project that feels practical, not through anything that sounds clever. And this is connected to something larger. Cooking became therapy for a generation that doesn't really trust therapy. Not because they're against the concept exactly, more because they grew up in an era where emotional maintenance just wasn't discussed much. So they developed these side door coping systems instead. Woodworking, motorcycles, gardening, smoking meat, bread making, beer brewing. Activities where you can focus completely without having to explain yourself. A Gen X man can spend 8 hours making homemade pastrami and process about half his adult life during it without saying a single word out loud. And spending 3 weeks watching bacteria turn flour into bread is a deeply Gen X way to deal with the fact that everything feels slightly out of control. The jar doesn't care about your stress levels. It just keeps going. There's something quietly reassuring about that, but here's what nobody really talks about. And it's the part of this that surprised me most when I found it. The Gen X man who cooks is working through something that started with his parents' divorce. This sounds more dramatic than it actually is. So let me explain. Researchers who study this generation consistently find that the emotional independence they developed as latchkey kids came with a hidden cost. They got very good at functioning alone. They got considerably less good at asking for connection directly. The figure-it-out-yourself default that served them so well at 9 years old became a pattern that followed them into adulthood. And what it produced in a lot of cases was men who struggle to seek intimacy through words but are remarkably good at seeking it through actions. Cooking for someone turns out to be a nearly perfect workaround for this. It's care expressed through skill. It's "I value you" communicated through a braised short rib rather than a conversation. ARP researchers studying Gen X men and loneliness described their social style as shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. They connect through shared activity rather than emotional disclosure, and cooking is maybe the purest version of that. A Gen X man is considerably more likely to invite you over to help him smoke a brisket than to invite you over to talk about how things are going. The brisket is the discussion. The 6 hours tending a fire together is the intimacy. The fact that nobody called it intimacy is kind of the whole point. That's not avoidance. That's a functional form of connection. Once you understand what it's doing, it makes complete sense. And you can see this pattern in how he socializes around food too. He doesn't host dinner parties in the traditional sense. He hosts projects. Come over Saturday, I'm trying a new brisket method. Come over Sunday, I'm doing a fermentation thing. It'll take all afternoon. The invitation is always structured around doing something together, because doing something together is how he knows to be close to people. The food is the vehicle. It always was. And now the barbecue. Because we absolutely have to talk about the barbecue. 70% of American households own a grill. And in that 70%, the person standing at it on a Saturday afternoon is overwhelmingly, statistically, a man. About 67% of the time, according to Michigan State University research. He's often Gen X. He's been at it for 3 hours already. He has a thermometer, probably 2. He has opinions about whether charcoal or gas is more respectable, and those opinions are held with a conviction that most people reserve for important political beliefs. Walk into some suburban backyard, and there's a smoker that looks capable of launching satellites. Digital temperature probes, custom charcoal blends, a Bluetooth monitoring app that he claims he hates and checks every 12 minutes. The whole setup looks like a mission control center for the production of one brisket. The academic term for what's happening at the grill is hegemonic masculinity, cooking as performance of the provider role outside the feminized space of the indoor kitchen. Anthropologists have written about this with tremendous seriousness, and they're not wrong. But there's something more practical going on too, and I think it's actually funnier and more honest than the academic framing. The backyard grill gave an entire generation of men a way to cook without it becoming a subject for anyone to have feelings about. In the kitchen, there are still echoes of that old gendered discomfort. Who does what it means, what it says about the relationships. But outside, at the grill, all of that dissolves. You're just a man in charge of fire. That's the oldest thing in the world. Nobody's going to make it weird. So the grill became not just a cooking method, but a psychological permission structure, a way to take the thing he's actually passionate about and present it in a socially uncomplicated container. The fact that he then obsessed over wood moisture levels, smoke ring chemistry, the exact resting phase in minutes, and the internal temperature at 3 different points in the brisket until it became genuinely complex. That's just the Gen X brain doing what it always does. Give it something functional, and it will find the depth. Every time. Boomers grilled burgers. Gen X built outdoor command centers. Australia deserves its own moment here because Australian barbecue culture has become something remarkably different, a national institution, treated with the seriousness of the Sunday roast. Gen X Australian men have built an entire social architecture around the BBQ. It is the gathering technology, the reason people come over. Studies of barbecue culture found that while female chefs are often celebrated for their connection to local tradition, male chefs, Gen X ones especially, are described as innovative, individual, seeking something new rather than preserving something old. That framing tells you something about how this generation sees itself in any kitchen. Not maintaining, but discovering. Not repeating what worked before, but figuring out what works better. The equipment deserves its own moment too, because it tells you something specific about how this generation thinks. The average Gen X male home cook does not have a Teflon pan from 2003. He has a cast iron skillet that is older than some of his relationships and significantly better maintained. He has a Japanese knife, possibly hand-hammered, possibly with a Damascus pattern that he could describe in detail if you made the mistake of asking, that cost somewhere between 4 and 10 times what a reasonable person would spend on a knife. He possibly has a sous vide circulator. He definitely has multiple types of salt, and will, if given an opening, explain why they're different. The shift from the baby boomer kitchen, practical, convenient, non-stick, to the Gen X kitchen is essentially the shift from gets the job done to does it with precision and intention. Japanese knives became a specific obsession, particularly in Canada and the UK. Chefs and serious home cooks spending upwards of $1,000 on a single blade because of the harder steel, the finer edge, the way it holds its sharpness through actual use. Major German manufacturers like Wüsthof and Henkel's, who had dominated the global knife market for generations, started adopting Japanese techniques specifically in response to Gen X demand. That's not a small cultural shift. That's a generation reorganizing an entire industry around its standards. And older masculine culture valued ruggedness, big heavy tools, durable machinery, things that could take a beating. Gen X shifted toward finesse, a perfect cut, controlled movement, skill over force, the knife as a symbol of that, and he spends accordingly. Gen X men spend an average of $692 a month on groceries and $893 a month at restaurants, both significantly higher than any other generation. They're about 17% of the global population, but drive spending that amounts to $15.2 trillion in 2025. The food category sits right at the center of that. This is not casual. This is where the money goes, which is always the most honest signal of what something actually means to a person. They want the familiar comfort foods, burgers, pizza, the things that existed in those empty houses, but they want the better version, the artisan version, the one made with actual ingredients and some thought behind it. Customized tradition, researchers call it, which sounds fancy for the same thing but done properly this time. There's a newer pattern worth watching because it's a very specific and very Gen X response to the current moment. Researchers are calling it the analog Saturday, the deliberate rejection, 1 day a week, of smart technology, digital noise, and the general acceleration of everything in favor of older methods. Cooking over wood or coal, using a paper recipe from an actual book, listening to something that requires a physical object to play. It's not nostalgia exactly. It's closer to decompression, relief. The Gen X man grew up analog and went digital out of necessity. He adapted completely, because that's what his generation does. But there's a growing awareness that the digital environment produces a specific kind of fatigue, and the kitchen, particularly the slow, tactile, attentive kind of cooking he's drawn to, is one of the few places where that fatigue actually lifts. This is a man who went from rotary phones to smartphones in one lifetime, who adapted to every platform, every format, every technological reinvention of everything, without anyone asking if he was okay with the pace. So eventually, some of them hit a point where standing over live fire for 6 hours started feeling like the most relaxing thing they could do with a weekend. Not because fire is romantic, because fire is simple. It does what it does. It doesn't send notifications. Fermentation fits here exactly. You cannot rush fermentation. You cannot check your email while monitoring a crock of kimchi. The process has its own timeline, and it does not care about yours, and for a generation that has lived through the acceleration of absolutely everything, there is something quietly satisfying about a project that simply refuses to be hurried. He didn't choose fermentation because he read that it was good for his gut microbiome. He chose it because it's interesting and it takes weeks, and that's fine. This is a man who survived the 1980s alone in a house, figured out a microwave dinner without instructions, adapted to every technological shift of the last 4 decades, and is now making charcuterie in a temperature-controlled environment in his spare bedroom. The arc is remarkable when you trace it from the beginning. The skill set is completely different. The psychology is identical. And professionally, this generation didn't just cook at home, they changed what professional cooking looked like globally. The Bocuse d'Or, the competition called the Culinary Olympics, was dominated by Gen X men from 1995 to 2015. Norway won 3 times in that window. Denmark and Sweden each won once. The shift from traditional French dominance toward a Northwestern style built on precision, minimalism, and technical rigor is essentially a portrait of what Gen X brought to professional cooking. Less about performing history, more about interrogating every assumption, and then deciding from evidence what the best approach actually is. That skepticism of received wisdom, of the way things have always been done, of anyone who sounds like they're selling something, is probably the most distinctly Gen X quality there is. And it showed up in how they cooked, both professionally and at home. They read about the Maillard reaction not because someone told them to, but because they wanted to understand what was actually happening to the meat. They tested ratios in bread because the recipe in the book didn't explain the reasoning, and they needed the reasoning. Ramsay didn't just learn techniques, he mastered them, and then enforced them with unusual intensity. Blumenthal didn't just cook French food, he asked why it worked the way it did, and then rebuilt it from first principles. Bourdain didn't just eat, he used food as a tool to connect to things that mattered. Different personalities. Same generation underneath. Question authority, trust skill, figure it out yourself. That's the Gen X approach to everything. And in the kitchen, it produced something impressive. People joke about dad cooking. But objectively, some of the most influential food cultures of the last 30 years came directly out of this generation. Not through marketing, not through aesthetics, through competence. Which is how Gen X usually changes things. Quietly, while other generations are busy making noise about it. Something else is happening now that's worth paying attention to. As Gen X men age, cooking is becoming more central to identity, not less. Partly because of the spending power, they control more food-related purchasing than any other demographic right now, and that influence isn't shrinking until at least 2036, according to projections. But also because a lot of the other identity anchors weakened along the way. Corporate loyalty disappeared, marriage rates shifted, retirement looks uncertain, social institutions thinned out, so people returned to tangible things. Feed yourself, feed your friends, build routines, learn skills, create something with your hands where the outcome depends entirely on how much attention you paid. And cooking ages unusually well for men in a way that most hobbies don't. A lot of male hobbies get physically harder over time. Cooking gets better, patience improves, taste improves, technique improves. Nobody looks at a 60-year-old man who makes extraordinary brisket and thinks he should dial it back. There's no ceiling on this particular obsession, which for a generation that built its identity around mastery is actually a significant thing. There's also a quieter cultural shift happening with younger men watching all of this. Younger generations are increasingly seeing cooking not as helping domestically, but as part of masculinity itself, as something a man does because he's capable and interested, not because it was assigned to him. That's a meaningful change, and Gen X men didn't create it through activism or speeches. They created it by being good at it, consistently, in their own kitchens for decades. One guy learns sourdough during a rough stretch. Another perfects ramen broth after burnout. Another builds the ideal backyard smoker setup over 2 years because that's just what he does on weekends. And eventually, younger men look at them and think, that actually looks good. Not performative good, not influencer good. Solid. So, where does this leave our man? The one with the knife and the 3 types of salt, standing in his kitchen on a Saturday morning with nowhere to be and nobody coming over. He's not performing wellness. He's not doing a thing he saw online. He's not going through a phase. He's doing what he's always done. Figuring it out himself, building something real with his hands, creating a small controlled environment where the outcome depends on skill and attention and nothing else. It's the same thing he was doing at 9 years old, alone in that house. He's just considerably better at it now, and the steaks are more delicious. He'll spend 4 hours on something most people would do in 40 minutes, and he won't think about those 4 hours as effort. He'll think about them as exactly where he wanted to be. And at the end, there will be something worth eating, and whether anyone else is there to eat it or not. That was never really the point. The point was the making. The point was the problem to solve, the skill required, and the result you could taste. A lot of Gen X men grew up emotionally unsupervised. They became independent very early, maybe too early. And so later in life, many of them found ways to express care that didn't require explaining themselves. Through fixing things, through showing up, through feeding people, because cooking lets a man create comfort without having to have a conversation about it. You don't need a long emotional discussion to hand somebody a perfect plate of food. The gesture already says enough. And for Gen X men specifically, that may be the closest thing to emotional fluency they were ever taught, which is probably why so many of them keep cooking long after the trend factor disappears, long after the food channels, long after the gadgets, long after any external reason to care about it. Because underneath the knives and the smokers and the fermentation jars and the 3 types of salt, the kitchen solved an older problem first. A lonely kid came home to an empty house and learned how to take care of himself. Then he just never fully stopped. He's going to need a sharper knife eventually. He already knows which one. If this hit a little close to home, subscribe. And come to comments to share your best recipes.